The drone swept low over the Bitterroot Range at first light, its camera capturing what the search teams had been looking for across 3 brutal days. 3 pickup trucks sat abandoned in a clearing 8 miles from any maintained road, doors hanging open like broken wings, keys still dangling from ignitions, rifles leaning against tailgates, safeties engaged, unfired. No blood, no bodies, just silence. The kind of silence that made experienced rescue workers nervous. Sheriff Dalton Kessler stood at the edge of the clearing, studying the scene with the careful attention of a man who had spent 30 years reading violence. The trucks were expensive, late-model Fords with custom lift kits and premium hunting gear stacked in the beds. These were not amateurs who had gotten lost on a day hike. The radio crackled at his hip. "Sheriff, we found something." Deputy Meredith Hale's voice carried an edge that Kessler recognized immediately. The sound of someone young enough to still be shocked by what mountains could do to men who underestimated them. "What have you got, Merritt?" "Phone, dropped by the middle truck. Screen's cracked, but it still works. Last call logged was to 911, 3 days ago." Kessler walked to where Hale stood holding an evidence bag. Through the plastic, he could see the phone's screen. The call log showed a timestamp, 11:47 p.m., 3 nights prior. Duration, 43 seconds before the connection dropped. "Can we hear it?" Hale pulled up the county dispatch recording on her tablet. The voice that came through was male, mid-40s, breathing hard, panicked. "Cascade County, we need help. We're lost. Morrison property. We shouldn't have. She's out here. She's hunting us." Static, heavy breathing. "Sir, what's your location?" "I don't know. Everything looks the same. We tried to leave, but she's watching. I know she is." The line went dead. Kessler handed the tablet back to Hale. His jaw was tight. "She," he said quietly. "Sir?" He said, "She. Morrison property. That's the Ashford woman's land." Hale looked back at the abandoned trucks, then at the dense forest that surrounded them on all sides. The kind of terrain where you could hide an army, or become completely lost in a matter of hours. "You think she did something to them?" Kessler didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about a conversation he'd had 6 months ago. A young woman with a scar running from shoulder to wrist on her left arm, sitting across from his desk with a folder full of documentation. Calm, controlled. The kind of calm that came from training, not nature. "Get the search teams deeper into the sector," he said finally, "and get me everything we have on Corporal Bryn Ashford." 18 months earlier. The realtor's office in Missoula smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. Janet Holbrook had been selling Montana property for 23 years, and she prided herself on reading clients quickly. The woman sitting across from her desk was hard to read. Bryn Ashford was 27 years old, though she carried herself with the bearing of someone much older. Athletic build, maybe 5'8", with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a plain black t-shirt and jeans, but the way she sat, back straight, hands folded, scanning the room's exits without appearing to, suggested military training. The scar on her left arm was impossible to miss. It ran from her shoulder down to her wrist, a thick rope of tissue that spoke of serious trauma and extensive surgery. 640 acres, Janet said, sliding the property listing across the desk. Bitterroot Range, elevation between 6,000 and 8,000 feet. Remote doesn't begin to cover it. Nearest neighbor is 12 miles by road. No power lines, no municipal water. You'd be running on solar and well water. Bryn studied the photos without touching them. Her eyes moved systematically across each image, cataloging details. Previous owner? Colonel Garrett Voss, retired Army, bought it in 1982, lived there off and on for 30 years. He's selling because, Janet hesitated. Well, there've been problems. What kind of problems? Poachers. The land borders national forest, and there's a group of local hunters who've been using it as their personal game preserve for years. Colonel Voss tried to stop them, filed reports, put up signs, even hired a security company for a while. Nothing worked. They'd wait until he left for the winter, then come back. Eventually, he just gave up. Bryn's expression didn't change. How long has this been going on? 15 years, give or take. And law enforcement? Janet shifted in her chair. Cascade County is big, really big. 2 deputies covering 2,400 square miles. Response time to that elevation, assuming the roads are passable, is 4 to 6 hours. For trespassing complaints, she let the sentence trail off. Bryn nodded once. Price? $400,000. Colonel Voss is firm on that. He put a lot of money into the infrastructure. Solar array, well drilling, the cabin itself. It's solid construction. I'll take it. Janet blinked. You want to see it first? Maybe spend a night up there? Get a feel for the isolation? No need. $400,000, cash, close in 30 days. Ms. Ashford, I have to be honest with you. This property is challenging. The isolation, the weather, the altitude, and these poachers, they're not going to stop just because there's a new owner. Colonel Voss is a former Army Ranger, and he couldn't handle them. You'd be up there alone. I don't need company, Bryn said quietly. I need distance. Something in her tone made Janet stop talking. She had sold property to people running from divorces, bankruptcies, scandals. This woman wasn't running from something. She was running towards something specific, something that required 640 acres of wilderness between her and the rest of the world. All right, Janet said slowly, I'll draw up the papers. But Ms. Ashford, can I ask, why this property specifically? Bryn stood. The movement was efficient, controlled. Everything about her was controlled. Because it has clear boundaries, she said, and I'm good at defending boundaries. The wire transfer cleared in 22 days. Bryn drove to Montana in a 15-year-old Ford pickup loaded with everything she owned, which wasn't much. Duffel bag of clothes, plastic tote of books, a locked case containing equipment that Janet Holbrook would never have approved of in a residential sale. The road to the property was exactly as advertised, 20 miles of dirt and gravel that turned to mud in the spring and ice in the winter. It took her truck 45 minutes to climb from the valley floor to the cabin's elevation. The cabin sat at the highest defensible point on the property, built into a hillside with 3 sides offering clear sight lines across open meadows. The 4th side backed into rock face. Whoever had positioned it understood tactical advantage. Colonel Voss was waiting on the porch. He was 68 years old, lean and weathered, with the kind of face that had spent decades squinting into hard distances. He watched Bryn's truck approach without moving from his chair. She parked and got out. They studied each other for a long moment. Colonel Voss. Miss Ashford. His voice was gravel and cigarettes. Janet said you were Army. Ranger, 75th Regiment. His eyebrows went up slightly. Scout sniper qualification? Yes, sir. How old are you? 27. Voss made a sound that might have been a laugh. I was 40 before they let me near a scope. You must have been good. I was adequate. Adequate doesn't get you Ranger scrolled at your age. Adequate doesn't get you Scout sniper tabs. He stood slowly, joints protesting. Let me show you around. The cabin was 1,500 square feet, 1 large room serving as kitchen and living space, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. The construction was solid, log walls, metal roof, double-paned windows. The solar array on the south-facing slope was professional grade. The well was deep and reliable. Voss walked her through the property's boundaries, pointing out the fence posts he'd installed every 50 yards. Metal signs were bolted to each post. Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. They're weatherproof, Voss said. I've replaced them 6 times. The poachers like to use them for target practice. Bryn studied the nearest sign. It was pocked with bullet holes. How many in the group? 5. Same five for about 10 years now. Travis Kendrick is the leader, mid-40s, lives in Kalispell. The others are locals, experienced hunters, good equipment. They're not stupid, just entitled. You filed reports? Dozens. Sheriff Kessler is sympathetic but realistic. Not enough manpower, too much territory. By the time deputies could respond, the poachers would be long gone. Voss stopped at a fence post and touched one of the signs. I bought this land because I wanted peace. Somewhere quiet after 30 years of noise. But peace requires boundaries, and boundaries require enforcement. I couldn't enforce them alone. Why are you selling? Voss was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer. Because I'm tired, and because these mountains deserve someone who'll fight for them, someone with the skills and the will. He turned to look at her directly. Janet didn't tell you everything. The poachers aren't just crossing fences. 3 months ago, they came to this cabin. Middle of the night, spotlights, engines, the whole intimidation show. Wanted to make sure I understood who really owned this land. What did you do? Called the sheriff, filed another report. Nothing changed. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. This is why I'm really selling. I found these in the cellar, left them for whoever bought the place. Figured they might be useful. Bryn opened the envelope. Inside were topographic maps of the property, but not the standard USGS versions. These were hand-drawn, annotated with calculations and measurements. Elevation changes, lines of sight, acoustic properties, defensive positions marked with military precision. I bought this land in 1982, Voss said quietly. Cold War was still cold. Army intelligence had me survey potential observation posts in the Rockies, places where we could watch for Soviet reconnaissance teams if things got hot. This property was one of my survey sites. I mapped every inch of it, every vantage point, every place where terrain gives advantage. Bryn studied the maps. They were extraordinarily detailed, work that would have taken months. The Soviets never came, Voss continued, never needed the positions. But the survey data remains, and it's good data. This land has teeth, Ms. Ashford. You just have to know how to bite. He handed her a slip of paper with a phone number written in careful script. Virginia area code. That's my number. If things get difficult, call me, day or night. I may be old and tired, but I remember how these things work. They shook hands. Voss's grip was still strong. One more thing, he said. Those poachers, they're going to test you, probably within the first month. They'll want to see if you're different from me or just another person they can push off this land. When that happens, you need to decide who you are. Because there are no half measures up here. You defend your boundaries completely or you lose them forever. Bryn watched his truck disappear down the mountain road. Then she turned and looked at her new property. 640 acres of forest, meadow, and rock. Beautiful and brutal in equal measure. She walked to the nearest fence post and studied the bullet-riddled sign. Then she walked the entire perimeter of the property. It took her 7 hours. She photographed every fence post, every boundary marker, every angle of approach. She made notes in a weatherproof notebook, documenting the current state of her land. When she finished, she went to the cabin and unpacked her locked case. Inside were items that had nothing to do with civilian life. Night vision monocular, tactical vest with a faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch barely visible on the chest, range-finding binoculars, a black notebook filled with technical calculations, and a photograph. She stared at it for a long time before placing it face down in a drawer. Looking at it cost something she wasn't ready to pay. The poachers came on day 7. Bryn was running her morning perimeter when the trail camera alerts hit her phone. She had installed 40 cameras across the property, positioned at strategic intervals along likely ingress routes. Solar-powered, motion-activated, with real-time cellular upload. She pulled up the footage on her phone as she jogged back to the cabin. 3 pickup trucks, 5 men, entering her property 8 miles in, well past any reasonable claim of accidental trespass. They drove directly to a meadow Bryn had marked on her maps as primary poaching site, elk migration route. She watched them unload equipment with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. All-terrain vehicles, portable butchering station, high-end rifles with premium optics. These were not casual hunters stumbling onto private land. One of the men walked to the nearest property marker and urinated on it while the others laughed. Bryn watched the entire thing with her expression unchanged. Then she opened her weatherproof notebook to the first page and wrote, Day 7, first documented violation. 5 individuals, 3 vehicles, 8 miles interior, deliberate trespass. She photographed the license plates from the camera footage, ran them through a database that civilian Bryn Ashford should not have had access to, but Ranger Corporal Ashford absolutely did. The results came back quickly. Travis Kendrick, age 43, 3 arrests for domestic violence over 15 years. Charges dropped twice. Convicted once, sentence suspended. Cullen Pritchard, age 38, under investigation by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks for illegal game trafficking. The others had similar patterns. Men who had learned that certain behaviors carried no consequences if you were careful about where you committed them. Bryn closed the notebook and began her morning routine. 30 pull-ups on the bar mounted in the cabin's doorframe. Perfect form, controlled breathing, no wasted movement. Then 5 miles across her property, memorizing every rock, every tree, every fold in the terrain, building a mental map that would be as detailed as Colonel Voss's survey data. The rifle hanging above the fireplace was an M110 semi-automatic sniper system. Not the civilian AR-10 it resembled, but the actual military weapon she had carried through Afghanistan and Iraq. Technically illegal for her to own after discharge. Technically, there were a lot of things about Bryn Ashford that didn't match civilian regulations. She cleaned it every Sunday. Disassembled, cleaned, oiled, reassembled. The ritual was meditative, a connection to the person she used to be before she bought 640 acres of isolation. The violations continued. Day by day, week by week, Bryn documented everything. Day 14, same 5 men, same location. Killed 2 elk illegally, left gut piles contaminating the stream. Day 23, expanded to 3 different locations on her property, setting up semi-permanent camps. Day 31, vandalized 4 property signs with spray paint. 1 sign shot repeatedly until it fell from the post. By day 45, Bryn had 17 documented violations captured on camera. She compiled everything into a professional folder: photographs, license plates, GPS coordinates, timestamps, video evidence. Then she drove to the Cascade County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Dalton Kessler was 56 years old and looked older. 28 years carrying a badge in counties where backup might be hours away had put lines on his face that had nothing to do with age. He listened to Bryn's presentation without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back and rubbed his eyes. "This is good documentation," he said finally. "Really good. Military training?" "Yes, sir." "Thought so. I ran your name after Janet Holbrook called to verify the sale. Hit some walls I don't have clearance to get through." Bryn said nothing. Department of Defense employment with details redacted. Service record sealed. "You were more than just Army, weren't you, Miss Ashford?" "I served. I was discharged honorably. That's all that's relevant." Kessler nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Look, I'm going to be straight with you. This county is 2,400 square miles. I have 2 deputies. Response time to your elevation is 4 to 6 hours on good roads. In winter, we might not be able to reach you for days. For trespassing complaints, especially when the trespassers will be gone by the time we arrive, the priority is low." "So what am I supposed to do?" "Document everything," which you're doing. "File reports," which you're doing. "Get a good lawyer and pursue civil action. It'll take years and cost more than the property's worth, but it's the legal avenue. Bryn stood. Thank you for your time, Sheriff. Ms. Ashford. Kessler's voice stopped her at the door. Those men are dangerous. Travis Kendrick has put 2 women in the hospital. Cullen Pritchard is under investigation for smuggling. They're not going to be intimidated by a young woman living alone, no matter how well you document their crimes. Please be careful. I'm always careful, Sheriff. After she left, Kessler pulled up her file again. The parts he could access were impressive. Army Ranger qualification before age 22. Scout Sniper School graduate, she was one of only 12 women who had ever earned that tab. Silver Star for Valor in Afghanistan. The citation was partially redacted, but what remained was striking. Eliminated 7 enemy combatants in a 90-second engagement window. Precision fire under extreme conditions. Direct action resulted in successful extraction of 23 civilian personnel. 7 targets in 90 seconds. That wasn't combat. That was surgical execution. The parts of her file that were completely redacted bothered him more. SEER instructor certification, advanced psychological operations training, asymmetric warfare specialist. Kessler closed the file and stared at his desk for a long time. What the hell did they train you to do? He said to the empty office. Day 83. Bryn found boot prints crossing her eastern boundary at dawn. She photographed them from multiple angles, measured the stride length, sketched the tread pattern in her notebook. Size 11. Lug sole. Deep heel strike indicating a man over 200 pounds. The prints led 8 miles into her property before disappearing near one of the established poaching camps. She followed them silently, moving through the forest with the trained economy of someone who had spent years in places where sound meant death. At the camp, she found fresh evidence: beer cans, food wrappers, cigarette butts, trash scattered with the carelessness of people who believed no one would hold them accountable. She photographed everything. Then she returned to the cabin and filed her 4th police report. Sheriff Kessler's voice on the phone was sympathetic but tired. I'll send someone up next week, Ms. Ashford, after Deputy Hale gets back from training in Billings. Next week. Best I can do. I'm sorry. Bryn hung up without responding. That night, she sat at her table with Colonel Voss's maps spread before her. She traced the elevation lines with one finger, calculating sight angles and distance ratios, building a picture in her mind of how this terrain could be used, how 640 acres could become a fortress if you understood its geometry. She opened the drawer where she kept the face-down photograph, stared at it for a long moment, then she turned it over. Sergeant Lucas Brennan smiled at her from the frame. 29 years old, Ranger scrolled, her spotter for 3 years across 2 deployments. The best friend she'd ever had. The photograph had been taken 2 hours before he died. Kandahar, Afghanistan, August 2021. The rooftop was concrete and rebar, 3rd story of a half-collapsed apartment building on the edge of the evacuation zone. Bryn lay prone behind her M110, scanning the street below through the scope. Lucas was beside her with a spotting scope and rangefinder. The evacuation was chaos. American withdrawal, Taliban advancing, thousands of Afghan civilians desperate to reach the airport. Intelligence had flagged a credible threat. Taliban fighters positioning to ambush a convoy carrying 23 interpreters and their families. Got movement, Lucas said quietly. 300 meters, northeast corner, 2nd floor window. Bryn adjusted, found the target. Male, mid-20s, AK-47, watching the street with the patience of someone waiting for a specific moment. Confirmed. Wind 3 miles per hour, northwest. Range 297. Clear to engage. The street below was filling with civilians. Women, children, old men pushing carts loaded with everything they owned. The convoy would enter this kill zone in 90 seconds. 7 targets identified, Lucas continued, voice steady. Window positions, rooftop positions. You're going to need to be fast, Raven. Raven, her call sign. Earned in her first deployment when a sergeant said she moved like a ghost and struck like a bird of prey. She found the space between heartbeats, the place where everything stopped. First shot. The suppressor muffled the sound but didn't silence it. The target dropped. Hit. Second target, northeast roof. Second shot, 4 seconds after the first. Hit. Third target. She worked methodically. 7 shots, 7 targets, 90 seconds. Lucas calling corrections, reading wind, guiding her through the sequence with the practiced synchronization of people who trusted each other. Absolutely. Last target down, convoys clear. The vehicles rolled to the intersection below. 23 interpreters and their families, unaware of how close they had come to death. The evacuation would succeed because of 2 soldiers on a rooftop, doing what they had been trained to do. Exfil route is clear, Lucas said, already packing his gear. Let's move before... The IED was command detonated, hidden in rubble that looked like every other pile of rubble in a city that had been bombed for 20 years. Someone had been watching the Watchers. The blast was close enough that Bryn felt the pressure wave before she heard the sound. Lucas was 3 feet closer to the edge. She saw him start to fall, reached for him. His hand caught hers for a moment, their eyes locked. Then he was gone. Bryn rolled to the ledge. Lucas lay in the street below, 3 stories down, surrounded by the rubble that had killed him. Blood spreading across the concrete in a pool that looked black in the late afternoon sun. She was moving before conscious thought. Down 3 flights of stairs, weapons slung, focused only on reaching him. Other rangers were converging on the scene, providing cover, calling for medevac. She reached him and dropped to her knees. His eyes were open, still conscious, probably not for long. "I'm here," she said. "Medevac's coming. Stay with me, Lucas." He tried to smile, failed, blood on his lips. "Not your fault," he whispered. "You cleared the route, did everything right. Don't talk, save your strength. Can't protect everyone, Raven." His breathing was labored. "But you tried." The medevac arrived in 6 minutes. Lucas died in 4. Bryn held him for those 4 minutes, watching the light fade from his eyes, while around them the evacuation continued, saving the people they had been sent to save, at a cost she would carry forever. Montana, day 121. Bryn closed the drawer, turning the photograph face down again. Lucas's voice echoed in her memory. Can't protect everyone. But she could protect this land, these boundaries, this one thing that was hers to defend. Day 121 brought a new escalation. The trail cameras caught them in the afternoon. Travis Kendrick's gang, but this time they drove deeper than before, past their usual camping spots, past the meadows and into the high country. Within 200 yards of her cabin, they left a dead elk carcass on her porch, an illegal kill, gutted and dumped like garbage. The message was clear. We can get this close any time we want. Spray paint on her shed. Bitch in red letters 3 feet high. More trash scattered across her property. Beer cans, food wrappers, cigarette butts. Contamination and contempt in equal measure. Bryn documented everything, photoed from multiple angles, made notes in her weatherproof notebook, filed police report number 5. Sheriff Kessler's voice on the phone was tight with controlled anger, but his words were the same. "I'll send someone up next week, I promise. But Miss Ashford, please understand, we're stretched beyond capacity. If these men are escalating, you might want to consider..." "Consider what, Sheriff?" "Maybe selling, going somewhere with neighbors, somewhere safer." Bryn hung up. She cleaned the elk carcass off her porch, scrubbed the spray paint from her shed, collected every piece of trash and documented its GPS location before disposal. Then she sat on her porch with coffee and watched the sun set behind the peaks. Day 147 would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. That day would require a choice. The kind of choice that Lucas had talked about in his final moments. The choice between protecting something or accepting that some things could not be protected. Bryn Ashford was done accepting. The mountains were quiet as darkness fell. Somewhere in that darkness, 5 men were making plans. Planning to return, planning to escalate, planning to drive another woman off land they had claimed as their own. They didn't know who Bryn Ashford was, didn't know what she had done in places where the rules were written in blood and enforced without mercy. Didn't know that the woman living alone on the mountain was not helpless. She was simply waiting. Day 147 arrived with the kind of stillness that precedes violence. Bryn woke at 0430 hours, as she did every morning. 30 pull-ups, 5-mile run across terrain that was becoming as familiar as her own heartbeat. Coffee measured precisely, grounds weighed on a small digital scale. The rituals kept her grounded, kept her connected to the discipline that had carried her through 7 years of service. The trail cameras had been quiet for 3 days. No violations, no trespassing. The silence should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Bryn knew the pattern by now. 83 days of observation had taught her how Travis Kendrick's group operated. They came in cycles. A week of activity, then 3 to 4 days of absence. Planning their next incursion, gathering supplies, building confidence. The quiet meant they were coming back. She spent the morning reviewing Colonel Voss's survey maps. The topographic detail was extraordinary. Every elevation change marked to the meter. Sightlines calculated with the precision of someone who had spent decades in Army intelligence. Acoustic properties noted at key positions. One notation caught her attention. Observation Post Alpha, elevation 7,240 feet, clear line of sight to primary approach routes. Acoustic advantage due to valley effect. Defensible position, single access point. She found the location on her maps, a rocky outcropping on the eastern edge of her property, overlooking the routes the poachers typically used. 3 miles from her cabin as the crow flies. 6 miles by the terrain she would need to traverse. Bryn had scouted it once before, but had not fully appreciated its tactical significance. Now, studying Voss's notes, she understood. From that position, someone with the right equipment could observe nearly 40% of the property, could watch, could wait, could control the narrative of what happened in the darkness below. The sun was setting when her phone vibrated with the first alert. Trail camera 17, eastern boundary, 3 vehicles. She pulled up the footage. Travis Kendrick's trucks, rolling past the no trespassing signs without slowing. 5 men visible through the dusty windows, laughing about something. Bryn watched them drive 8 miles into her property. Watched them set up camp in the same meadow they always used. Watched them unload equipment with the casual arrogance of people who believe themselves untouchable. Then she made the call. The phone rang 4 times, long enough that she almost hung up. Then a voice answered, gruff and alert despite the late hour. Ashford. It wasn't a question. Colonel Garrett Voss had been expecting this call, had probably been expecting it since the day she bought his property. Colonel, Bryn said, I need guidance. You've exhausted legal options. Yes, sir. They've escalated beyond harassment. Yes, sir. Day 147, they came to my cabin. Midnight, intimidation display, vandalism, threats. There was a pause. She could hear Voss breathing on the other end of the line. Steady, controlled. The breathing of a man who had made difficult decisions in difficult places. You found my survey data. I did. Do you understand what I was planning for? What that land was supposed to defend against? Soviet reconnaissance teams, Cold War contingencies. I spent 6 months mapping every inch of that property, every position where an operator could establish observation, every route where targets could be channeled, every acoustic anomaly that could be exploited. His voice was quiet but intense. The Soviets never came, but the principles remain. Terrain is a weapon, Corporal. You just have to know how to wield it. Bryn closed her eyes. Is it legal if they die and I never fire a shot? I'm not a lawyer. I'm a soldier. You've documented months of violations. Law enforcement has failed to respond. These men came to your home and threatened you directly. You have every right to defend your property. He paused. But here's what I can tell you about fear, Corporal. Fear makes people stupid. Stupid people make mistakes. If you can make 5 experienced hunters believe something is hunting them, they'll run. And men who run in the dark, in terrain they don't understand, toward destinations they can't reach, nature handles the rest. Psychological operations. The most effective warfare there is. You never have to touch them, never have to confront them. You become the mountain. You become the thing that exists in the spaces between what they can see and what they imagine. And when they run, when they panic, when they make the choice to flee instead of surrender, that choice is theirs, not yours. Bryn was silent for a long moment. Outside her window, darkness had settled over the Bitterroot Range. Somewhere out there, 5 men were making camp, making plans, making the assumption that she was helpless. This conversation, she said quietly, never happened, Voss finished. You called to ask about property maintenance. I told you the well pump is reliable, but the solar array needs checking twice a year. That's all that was discussed. Understood? Yes, sir. One more thing, Corporal. SERE training taught you to resist psychological operations, but it also taught you how to deploy them. You know what breaks a person's will. You know how to make someone believe their situation is hopeless. Use that knowledge. But remember, once you start this, you cannot stop halfway. Either you defend your boundaries completely, or you lose them forever. The line went dead. Bryn sat in the darkness of her cabin for another hour, thinking, planning, accepting what was about to happen. Then she opened the locked case under her bed. The tactical vest came out first. Faded multicam pattern, the 75th Ranger Regiment patch barely visible on the chest. She ran her fingers over it, remembering the weight of it in Kandahar, in Baghdad, in places that didn't have names on maps. Night vision monocular, AN/PVS-14, military grade, the kind of equipment that civilians weren't supposed to own. Range-finding binoculars, Vectronics PL-RF-25, accurate to within 1 meter at 1,500 yards. Portable Bluetooth speaker, small, weatherproof, with a battery life of 40 hours. Fishing line, 200 feet of 20-pound test, nearly invisible in low light. The black notebook came out last. She had started it 3 weeks ago, after the harassment incident on day 121. It was filled with calculations, range estimations, wind patterns, acoustic mapping based on Voss's survey data, the geometry of fear written in ballistic math. She packed a 3-day field kit. No fire, no hot food, just cold rations, water purification tablets, and the equipment she would need to become something other than human in the eyes of 5 men who thought themselves apex predators. At 0400 hours, she wrote a final entry in her weatherproof notebook. Day 147, all legal options exhausted. Territorial defense authorized. Objective, 0 casualties by my hand. Method, psychological warfare via terrain manipulation. Duration, 72 hours maximum. She set her watch alarm. Then she walked out of the cabin and into the darkness, moving toward Observation Post Alpha with the silent efficiency of someone who had spent years learning to become invisible. The forest swallowed her. Behind her, the cabin sat dark and empty. Ahead of her, 5 men slept in their camp, unaware that the next 3 days would destroy everything they thought they understood about these mountains. Bryn Ashford was done waiting. The hunt had begun. Hour 6. Observation Post Alpha was everything Colonel Voss's notes had promised. A rocky outcropping sheltered by pines elevation 7,240 feet, with clear sight lines down into the valley where Travis Kendrick's camp sat like a target in a scope. Bryn had taken 4 hours to cover the 6 miles of terrain, not because the distance was challenging, but because she moved with deliberate care. No broken branches, no disturbed ground cover, no evidence of her passage. Ghostcraft, the Rangers called it, the art of moving through hostile territory without leaving a trace. She established her position as dawn broke. The camp below was stirring, 5 men emerging from tents, starting a fire, making coffee. From 800 meters away through her range-finding binoculars, she could see their faces clearly. Travis Kendrick, 43, the leader. Tall, weathered, moving with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged. Cullen Pritchard, 38, nervous energy, constantly scanning the tree line. The smart one, the one who would break first. Harlan Vickers, 45, heavy-set and methodical. Former military, Bryn guessed from the way he organized his gear. J.D. Morrison, 37, the follower, went where Travis led without question. Rick Dalton, 40, quietest of the group, watched more than he talked. She studied them for 2 hours, learning their patterns, who woke first, who checked the perimeter, who was careless with equipment, building psychological profiles based on behavior. Lucas's voice echoed in her memory, her spotter, her friend, teaching her the art of observation. Before you take the shot, know your target. Not just range and wind. Know how they move. Know what makes them comfortable. Know what will make them panic. Bryn wasn't planning to take any shots, but the principle remained. Know your targets, understand what they fear, then become that fear. At 1100 hours she began. The portable speaker was positioned in a tree 200 meters from their camp, secured with fishing line run through a pulley system she had rigged in the darkness. The speaker was camouflaged with pine needles and bark, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. She pulled up the audio file on her phone. Wolf howls, recorded from her cabin over the past month. But not the kind of howls that belonged in October. These were territorial calls, the kind wolves made during mating season in February. Wrong season, wrong context, unnatural. She played it at low volume, just loud enough to be heard at the camp. A 3-second burst, then silence. Through her binoculars, she watched the reaction. Cullen's head snapped up. He said something to the others. They stopped what they were doing and listened. 15 minutes of silence, long enough for them to decide they'd imagined it. Then she played it again, 5 seconds this time, from a different speaker position, 300 meters on the other side of their camp. This time, all 5 men heard it. Travis pointed in the direction of the sound. Harlan grabbed binoculars and scanned the tree line. They would see nothing. The speaker was too well hidden. The sound had already stopped. 20 minutes later, she played a third burst, this time from behind their camp, surrounding them with sounds that shouldn't exist, creating the impression of multiple wolves circling their position. But any experienced hunter would know, wolves didn't hunt in October, and they didn't circle human camps. The sounds were wrong, impossible, unnatural. That was the point. Bryn watched them argue, Travis dismissive, Cullen clearly unsettled, Harlan trying to be rational, explaining why the sounds didn't make sense. She let them sit with that wrongness for 6 hours. No more sounds. Just the ordinary forest noises that made the earlier wrongness even more disturbing in retrospect. At 1800 hours, as darkness fell, she escalated. The fishing line system allowed her to move the speakers remotely, pulling them into new positions without leaving her observation post. She positioned one directly above their camp, 30 feet up in a pine tree. This time she didn't play wolf howls. She played a recording of their own voices. She had captured the audio yesterday from trail camera 17, Travis talking about what they would do if that bitch tried to stop them. Crude threats, violent fantasies, the kind of talk that men engaged in when they thought no one was listening. She played it back to them, Travis's own voice drifting down from the darkness above their camp, but delayed by 3 seconds. So they would hear him speak, then hear his own words echoed back impossibly from the trees overhead. The effect was immediate and profound. Travis stopped talking mid-sentence. The entire camp went silent, 5 men staring up into darkness, trying to understand what they had just heard. Cullen said something sharp. Bryn couldn't hear the words, but the body language was clear. Fear, confusion, the beginning of panic. Travis tried to reassert control, checked his rifle, organized a perimeter sweep. 3 men walked into the forest with flashlights, searching for the source of the impossible sounds. Bryn watched them stumble through the darkness. They found nothing. How could they? The speaker was already gone, pulled back through the trees using her fishing line system. By the time they reached the position where the sound had originated, there was no evidence anything had been there. They returned to camp an hour later, shaken, arguing among themselves. That night, none of them slept well. Bryn watched through her night vision monocular as they took turns on watch, staring into the forest, jumping at every normal sound, seeing threats in every shadow. She had touched nothing, confronted no one, simply introduced wrongness into their environment. And now that wrongness was spreading like poison through their group psychology. Lucas's voice again, from a training session years ago. The human mind craves patterns, craves explanations. When you break those patterns, when you make someone's reality unreliable, they fill the gaps with imagination. And imagination is always worse than reality. Hour 24. Dawn came with no relief for the men below. Bryn had given them a few hours of quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. Let them start to think maybe it had been nothing. Maybe they had overreacted. Then she took their equipment. She had moved during the darkest hours, using night vision to approach their camp. Not close enough to risk detection, just close enough to reach items they had left carelessly outside their tents. Cullen's GPS unit, sitting on a rock where he had placed it while reorganizing his pack. Rick's hunting knife, left on a log after he had used it to cut rope. JD's truck keys, hanging from a branch where he had hooked them, thinking they were secure. She took all 3 items. Then she walked 6 miles in a wide circle around their camp and left them in impossible locations. The GPS unit, balanced on a rock formation 3 miles away, in the opposite direction from where any of them had traveled. No footprints leading to it. No explanation for how it got there. The knife, stuck point down in a tree trunk 2 miles north of camp, 15 feet off the ground, requiring climbing gear to place. The truck keys, hanging from a branch directly on the trail they had used to enter the property, as if someone had intercepted them on their way in, taken the keys, and left them as a message. She was back at Observation Post Alpha before they woke. The discovery process was beautiful to watch. Cullen found his GPS missing first. Panic. Searching through his tent, dumping his pack. The device contained his route home, his waypoints, his entire navigation system. Rick discovered his knife was gone. More searching, more confusion. JD's keys missing triggered a camp-wide inventory. What else had been taken? What else was wrong? But here was the truly devastating part. Nothing else was disturbed. Tents untouched. Food supplies intact. Rifles exactly where they had been left. Someone had walked into their camp, taken 3 specific items, and left without a trace. Without waking anyone. Without leaving footprints or evidence. It should have been impossible. Travis tried to maintain control, organize a systematic search of the area around camp. They found the GPS unit at 1400 hours. The discovery made things worse, not better, because now they had to explain how the device had gotten 3 miles away. Had someone from the group taken it and didn't remember? Sleepwalking? Or had someone else, something else, been in their camp? Cullen was the first to break. Bryn couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. He wanted to leave, wanted to pack up and get off this mountain. The others argued with him, Travis especially, aggressive, physical, pushing Cullen back when he tried to walk toward the trucks. The group fractured into factions. Travis, Harlan, and JD wanted to stay, prove they couldn't be intimidated. Cullen and Rick wanted to leave. They had been hunters on these mountains for 15 years. They knew the difference between normal and wrong. This was wrong. The argument lasted an hour. Travis won through force of personality and implied violence. They would stay. They would prove nobody was going to push them off land they had claimed as their own. It was the worst decision they could have made. Hour 36. Night 2 began with a rock slide. Bryn had spent the afternoon scouting a slope 1 mile from their camp, loose scree and talus that needed only a small destabilizing force to create a cascade. She positioned carefully, found the keystone rocks that held everything in place, and waited. At 2200 hours, she dislodged them. The sound was massive, a roar of stone and earth tumbling down the mountain, lasting 30 seconds, loud enough to be heard for miles. The camp erupted in chaos. Men scrambling out of tents, grabbing rifles, flashlights sweeping the darkness, trying to determine direction and distance and threat level. Bryn watched from her position 800 meters away. The rock slide had been on the opposite side of the valley, nowhere near their camp. But in the darkness with adrenaline spiking, they couldn't know that. What they knew was something massive had just happened, and they had no idea what. Travis tried to organize a response, sent 2 men to investigate. Harlan and Rick moved toward the sound, rifles ready, lights scanning. They never found the source. By the time they reached the slope, there was nothing to see except fresh disturbance. Rock and dirt that had clearly fallen, but no way to determine why. Natural occurrence? Or triggered deliberately? The ambiguity was the weapon. While they were investigating the rock slide, Bryn moved to her secondary position, closer to camp, 200 meters, near enough to see details through night vision. She set up her final speaker position, this time loaded with a different audio file. Not wolf howls, not echoed voices, footsteps. She had recorded them walking through the forest yesterday. The distinctive sound of boots on pine needles, branches breaking, the rhythm of human movement. She played them in a circle around the camp, never from the same position twice, creating the impression of something, someone, walking around their perimeter, stalking them, just outside the range of their flashlights. The psychological effect was devastating, because now they had to choose, was it an animal or a person? An animal would be dangerous but comprehensible. They could defend against an animal. But a person? Someone walking circles around their camp in the middle of the night? Someone who could steal their equipment without waking them? Someone who knew this terrain better than they did? That was terror of a different kind. JD fired 6 shots into the darkness. Bryn watched the muzzle flashes, watched him empty his rifle at shadows, watched the others try to calm him down while simultaneously scanning the tree line with their own weapons ready. They found nothing. Of course they found nothing. The speakers were already gone, pulled back through her fishing line system. And Bryn had never been where JD was shooting. But now they had fired weapons, announced their fear to the entire mountain, and still found no target. The night deteriorated from there. Cullen's tent collapsed. The support ropes cut cleanly while they were distracted by JD's shooting. He emerged in a panic, tangled in fabric, convinced someone was attacking. Rick heard breathing, close, right next to his position. He spun with his rifle and found nothing, but he swore someone had been standing beside him. The breathing was Bryn, 200 meters away, playing audio through a speaker. But Rick's mind filled the gap between impossible sound and absent source with the worst explanation. By dawn, none of them had slept. They sat in a circle, backs to the fire, rifles pointing outward, exhausted, terrified, no longer certain what was real and what was imagination. Bryn watched the sun rise over 5 men who had entered her property with confidence and were now questioning their own sanity. She had not fired a shot, had not touched any of them, had simply introduced wrongness into their environment and let their minds do the rest. Colonel Voss had been right. Fear was the most effective weapon, and she was just getting started. Hour 48. The separation happened naturally. Dawn brought clarity, but not comfort. Travis tried to reassert control, but the group dynamics had shifted. 2 factions. 3 men who wanted to stay and prove they couldn't be broken. 2 men who wanted to leave immediately. The argument was brief and heated. Then it turned physical. Cullen shoved Travis. Travis shoved back harder. Harlan stepped between them. Rick grabbed his pack and started walking toward the trucks. The group shattered. Travis, Harlan, and JD headed west, deeper into the property, trying to flank whoever or whatever was harassing them, convinced that aggression was the answer. Cullen and Rick headed east, toward where they thought the trucks were parked, trying to escape. Bryn watched them split up and felt no satisfaction, only grim calculation. 5 targets had become 2 groups. Her mission parameters adjusted accordingly. She moved to intercept Cullen and Rick first. They were moving fast, panicked, not paying attention to their route, making mistakes. She didn't need to do much, just small adjustments to their path. A fallen log positioned to block one route, forcing them to detour. Boot prints in the mud leading in the wrong direction. Their own GPS unit, the one they had recovered, placed on a rock pointing them away from the trucks. Every adjustment subtle, every nudge pushing them deeper into terrain they didn't understand. By mid-afternoon, Cullen and Rick were hopelessly lost. The trucks that should have been 2 miles away were somehow still nowhere in sight. They argued about direction, checked their GPS repeatedly. The device insisted they were on the right path, but the terrain didn't match. The landmarks were wrong. They had been walking in circles for hours without realizing it. That was when Cullen broke completely. Bryn watched through her binoculars from 600 meters away, watched him sit down on a rock and put his head in his hands, watched Rick try to motivate him, then give up and sit down himself. They were defeated, not by violence, by confusion, by the mountain refusing to make sense. Rick pulled out his phone. No signal, but he recorded a voice memo anyway. Insurance, evidence, something to explain what had happened to them. Bryn couldn't hear the words, but she could imagine them. To whoever finds this, we got lost. We shouldn't have been here. We should have left when we had the chance. If we don't make it, tell our families we're sorry. They sat there for an hour. Then Rick stood up and started walking again. Cullen followed. Both men moving like sleepwalkers now, exhausted beyond reason, making decisions based on desperation rather than logic. Bryn let them go. She had done enough. The rest was up to them and the mountain. She turned her attention to Travis, Harlan, and JD. Hour 60. The western route was more treacherous, steeper slopes, loose rock, easy to fall if you weren't paying attention. Travis's group was moving with purpose, but purpose didn't protect against gravity. Harlan fell first. Bryn watched it happen from her new observation position. Harlan stepping onto what looked like solid ground, the earth giving way beneath him. A 4-foot drop into a ravine, landing badly on his left leg. The sound of the ankle breaking was audible even from 300 meters away. Travis and JD climbed down to help him. Harlan's face was gray with pain. The ankle was already swelling. He tried to stand and collapsed immediately. They faced a choice: carry him or leave him. Travis looked at JD, looked at Harlan, looked at the terrain they still had to cross. Then he made a decision that would haunt him. "I'll get help," Travis said. "Stay with him. I'll bring back a rescue team." JD's face showed betrayal. "You're leaving us?" "I'm getting help. I'll be faster alone." Travis was gone before JD could argue further. Bryn watched Travis disappear into the forest, moving fast, driven by guilt and fear in equal measure. Then she turned her attention back to JD and Harlan. Harlan was going into shock. The ankle needed medical attention. They needed evacuation. But they were 8 miles from the trucks, in terrain that would require a helicopter to extract them. JD tried his phone. No signal. Tried the radio. Nothing but static. They were alone, injured, afraid, and night was coming. Bryn could have called for help, could have used her satellite phone to contact search and rescue, could have ended this right now. But these men had chosen to be here, had chosen to ignore 147 days of warnings, had chosen to come to her cabin and threaten her, had chosen to believe that boundaries were suggestions. She let them sit with the consequences of those choices. Hour 72. Dawn on the third day brought silence. Bryn packed her equipment methodically, every speaker retrieved, every fishing line coiled, every trace of her presence erased from Observation Post Alpha. She moved through the forest like smoke, leaving nothing behind. The poachers' camp sat abandoned below, empty tents flapping in the wind, fire pit cold. 3 men had gone west, 2 had gone east. None had returned. She didn't know their fates yet, didn't need to. The mountain would decide. Her mission parameters were complete: 72 hours, 0 shots fired, psychological warfare via terrain manipulation, boundaries defended. She reached her cabin at 0800 hours, secured the tactical gear in its locked case, placed the black notebook in a drawer she would never open again, showered away 3 days of mountain and mission. At 0900 hours, she made coffee, sat on her porch, and waited. The helicopter sounds would come, the search teams, the questions. She was ready. At 1400 hours, Sheriff Dalton Kessler's truck appeared on the road below, climbing toward her cabin through the mud. Bryn set down her coffee mug and stood. The reckoning had begun. The search operation began on day 4. Sheriff Dalton Kessler stood in the command tent at the base of the mountain, studying maps that showed 40 square miles of wilderness marked in grids. Each grid represented territory that needed to be searched. Each grid was 6 hours of work for a 4-person team, moving through terrain that fought them at every step. 3 neighboring counties had sent personnel. Cascade County Search and Rescue had mobilized every available volunteer. 2 helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept patterns overhead, their rotors beating the air like mechanical heartbeats. They found the first truck on day 4, the second on day 6, the third on day 9, all of them abandoned, all of them with keys in the ignition, rifles untouched, equipment scattered like the owners had simply vanished mid-action. "It's like they just walked away from everything," Deputy Meredith Hale said, standing beside one of the trucks. She was 29, 5 years into her law enforcement career, and this was the strangest scene she had ever processed. Kessler crouched beside the truck, studying boot prints in the soft earth. Multiple sets, all leading away from the vehicle. The stride length was wrong, too long, too deep. These men had been running. "They were scared," he said quietly. "Of what?" Kessler stood and looked at the forest surrounding them. 40 square miles of mountains that could hide anything, or nothing, just trees and rock and the silence that made you question every sound. "That's the question, isn't it?" He pulled out his phone and scrolled to the file he had opened repeatedly over the past week. Bryn Ashford's service record. The parts he could access anyway. The rest was sealed behind classification levels he didn't have clearance to penetrate. But what he could see was enough. Army Ranger, Scout Sniper, Silver Star for Valor, SERE Instructor Certification, Advanced Psychological Operations Training, Asymmetric Warfare Specialist, skills that made someone very good at killing, or very good at making people kill themselves through fear. "I need to talk to the Ashford woman again," Kessler said. Hale looked at him sharply. "You think she's involved?" "I think 5 experienced hunters entered her property after months of harassment. I think they called 911 saying she was hunting them. I think they're now dead or missing. Yes, deputy, I think she's involved. I just can't figure out how. The drive to Bryn's cabin took 45 minutes. The road was worse than Kessler remembered. Mud from recent rain had turned sections into thick soup that grabbed at his truck's tires and held on like hands reaching from the earth. He arrived to find Bryn Ashford on her porch, splitting wood with an axe. The rhythm was hypnotic. Lift, swing, split. Lift, swing, split. Each piece of wood divided cleanly with a single strike. No wasted motion, no hesitation. She saw his truck coming and set the axe down, wiped her hands on her jeans, waited. Kessler got out slowly, studying her. She looked exactly as she had 6 months ago when she had walked into his office with a folder full of documentation. Calm, controlled, the kind of control that came from years of discipline. "Sheriff," she said, "coffee?" "That'd be appreciated, Miss Ashford." She led him inside. The cabin was neat to the point of being austere. Everything had a place, nothing unnecessary. The rifle above the fireplace was in its case. The table was clear except for a laptop and a weatherproof notebook. She poured coffee into 2 mugs, black, no sugar offered. She set one in front of him and sat across the table. "I heard helicopters," she said. "Search and rescue?" 5 men missing. Last known location was on or near your property. Bryn's expression didn't change. "The same men who've been trespassing for 6 months?" "The same. I hope you find them." The statement was delivered with perfect neutrality. No concern, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement of fact. Kessler sipped his coffee and chose his next words carefully. "Their families are worried. Travis Kendrick has 3 kids. Cullen Pritchard's wife hasn't heard from him in 8 days. These men have people who care about them." "I'm sure they do. Everyone's someone's father, brother, son." Bryn met his eyes. "That doesn't change what they did. Doesn't erase 147 days of violations. Doesn't undo the night they came to my cabin and threatened me. You have documentation of that harassment?" She stood and retrieved a folder from a drawer, placed it in front of him. Inside were photographs, video stills, timestamps. The midnight incident on day 147 was captured in high definition. Spotlights, vandalism, audio of threats that made Kessler's jaw tighten. "This is why you stayed inside after that night?" he asked. "For my safety, yes. When 5 men demonstrate they're willing to come to your home and intimidate you, the reasonable response is to shelter in place and hope they don't escalate further." "Did you see them leave?" "I stayed inside until I was certain they were gone. Then I cleaned the vandalism and documented the damage." She pulled out more photos. "I considered filing another report, but given the response to my previous 4 reports, I didn't think it would matter." The implication was clear without being accusatory. Law enforcement had failed her. She had been left to handle the situation alone. Kessler set down his coffee mug. "Miss Ashford, I ran a deeper background check after you left my office 6 months ago. You were more than just Army Ranger, weren't you?" "My service record is available through standard channels. Parts of it are. Other parts hit classification walls I don't have clearance to get through. What I could access was impressive. Silver Star, Scout Sniper Qualification, SEER Instructor Certified." He leaned forward slightly. "Psychological Operations Training, Asymmetric Warfare Specialist. Those are interesting specialties for someone who's now living alone on a mountain." Bryn's expression remained neutral. "I served my country in the capacities I was trained for. I was honorably discharged. That's all that's relevant. 7 targets eliminated in 90 seconds. Kandahar, 2021. That's what the citation says. The parts that aren't redacted anyway. That was a combat operation under direct threat to civilian lives. It has nothing to do with what's happening here." "Doesn't it?" Kessler kept his voice gentle. 5 men enter your property, 8 days later, 3 trucks abandoned, 5 men missing. Last communication was a 911 call saying you were hunting them. I haven't left my property in 8 days, Sheriff. I've been here, maintaining my cabin, doing routine work. If those men got lost and panicked, that's unfortunate, but I can't control what people do when they trespass on land they've been repeatedly warned to stay off of. Can I search the cabin? I'd prefer you get a warrant, but if it helps locate these men faster, you're welcome to look around. The permission was delivered calmly, the response of someone with nothing to hide. Kessler spent 30 minutes searching. Hale joined him, and together they went through every room, every closet, every storage space. The rifle above the fireplace was clean. Bore light showed no residue. It had not been fired recently, possibly not for months. Her boots by the door were clean and dry. No mud, no debris, no signs of extensive outdoor activity. In the bedroom, they found a locked case under the bed. Bryn opened it without hesitation when asked. Inside was tactical gear, night vision equipment, range-finding binoculars, the kind of equipment that suggested military background but proved nothing about recent activity. Everything looked unused, undisturbed, exactly as it should look for someone who owned surplus military equipment but had no reason to deploy it. The weatherproof notebook on the table showed entries dating back 6 months. The final entry was dated day 147. Harassment incident occurred, cleaned and documented. Law enforcement unable to respond, remained inside for safety. Nothing after that date, no mention of the missing men, no suggestion of any activity beyond normal cabin maintenance. Everything looks clean, Hale said quietly to Kessler as they finished searching. Too clean, Kessler replied, but he kept his voice low enough that Bryn wouldn't hear. They returned to the main room. Bryn was sitting at the table, same position, same calm expression. "Thank you for your cooperation," Kessler said. "If you see or hear anything, please contact us immediately." "Of course, Sheriff." He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "Ms. Ashford, one more question. Did you have any contact with Colonel Voss after you purchased this property?" Bryn paused for just a fraction of a second, long enough for someone trained to read micro-expressions to notice. "Colonel Voss called a few weeks after closing to ask how the property was working out. He gave me some advice about maintaining the solar array and well pump. That was the extent of our communication. It was technically true. The conversation had been about the property, just not about maintenance." Kessler nodded slowly. "Thank you for your time." Outside, as they drove back down the mountain, Hale broke the silence. "She did something. I know she did. You can feel it. Feeling isn't evidence. So we just let it go?" Kessler gripped the steering wheel tightly. "What would you have me do, Deputy? Arrest her for what? We have no bodies, no crime scene, no evidence of foul play. The medical examiner is going to rule natural causes when we find them. Exposure, poor decisions in hostile terrain. That's what the autopsy reports will say. But the 911 call says they were lost and scared. Doesn't prove she did anything illegal. She documented months of harassment. She filed multiple police reports that we failed to act on. She has video evidence of them threatening her at her own home. Every piece of evidence supports a woman who exhausted legal options and then sheltered in place for her own safety." Hale was quiet for a moment. "What do you think really happened up there?" Kessler didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the service record, about SEER training and psychological operations, about skills that the military spent years developing because they were effective in ways that conventional warfare couldn't match. "I think," he said finally, "that 5 men ignored clearly posted warnings on isolated private property. I think they harassed and threatened a woman who had every legal right to defend herself. I think they entered terrain they thought they understood and encountered something they were completely unprepared for." "You think she used her training?" "I think she used everything she had. And I think those men died because they made choices. Bad choices, repeated choices, choices that had consequences they didn't anticipate. He pulled onto the main road. But thinking isn't the same as proving. And without proof, all we have is a tragic accident. 3 weeks after the search began, Forest Service Ranger Yael Ostrander was surveying fire damage in the adjacent national forest when her dog started barking at a ravine. She climbed down carefully. The ravine was steep, choked with deadfall and undergrowth that made every step treacherous. The body was in a sitting position against a tree, male, mid-40s, wearing hunting gear. The decomposition suggested he had been there for several weeks. Yael called it in with shaking hands. State Police Detective Raymond Sears arrived by helicopter. He was 50 years old and had spent 3 decades processing crime scenes in rural Montana. He had seen deaths from exposure, from animal attacks, from accidents of every kind. This scene bothered him in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. The body was Harlan Vickers. Medical examiner confirmed it through fingerprints. Cause of death? Hypothermia and exposure. Broken ankle had prevented him from seeking shelter or help. He had simply sat down and died as his core temperature dropped. But the positioning bothered Sears. Harlan was facing back toward the Morrison property, as if he had been trying to return there, as if in his final moments the mountain he had been fleeing seemed safer than wherever he had been going. Over the next 2 weeks, they found 3 more bodies. Cullen Pritchard, 4 miles from Harlan, exhaustion and exposure. Evidence of running through dense forest at night, fractured ribs from a fall, deep lacerations across his face and arms from branches. Rick Dalton, 2 miles beyond Cullen. Similar pattern, running, falling, getting back up and running again until his body simply gave out. J.D. Morrison, 1 mile from Harlan. He had tried to carry Harlan and collapsed under the weight. Hypothermia took them both within hours of each other. Travis Kendrick was found 6 weeks later, 18 miles away across the Montana state line. Bear had scavenged the remains, but the medical examiner determined the bear had found him after death. Primary cause? Hypothermia and exhaustion. Detective Sears compiled his findings in a conference room at the county courthouse. Sheriff Kessler attended, Deputy Hale, the county coroner, the medical examiner. 4 bodies recovered, Sears began. 5th located but in Montana jurisdiction. All deaths consistent with exposure and hypothermia. All show evidence of extreme physical exertion prior to death. Fractured bones, lacerations, elevated cortisol and adrenaline even in tissue samples. They were running from something, the medical examiner said. But what? Sears pulled up a map showing where each body was found. They died over the course of 3 days, scattered across 8 miles of terrain, all moving away from the Morrison property where they had been camping. But here's what's unusual. Experienced outdoorsmen don't typically panic like this. These men knew wilderness survival. They had equipment, supplies, communication devices, yet they abandoned everything and ran. Psychological break? The coroner suggested. All 5 simultaneously? That's statistically unlikely. Sears looked at Kessler. What about the property owner? Kessler pulled out his file on Bryn Ashford. Former Army Ranger, Scout Sniper qualified, extensive psychological operations training. She documented 147 violations by these specific men over 6 months, filed multiple police reports. On day 147, they came to her cabin at midnight and engaged in harassment and vandalism. After that incident, she states she remained inside for her own safety. Do you believe her? I believe she never fired a weapon at anyone. I believe she never physically assaulted anyone. The evidence supports both those statements, absolutely. But, Sears pressed. Kessler was quiet for a moment. I believe she did something. I believe she used her training to make these men believe they were being hunted. I believe she manipulated their psychology and the terrain in ways that caused them to panic and flee. And I believe they died as a result of that panic. That's still homicide, Hale said. If she caused their deaths, can you prove it? Sears interrupted. Can you prove she did anything illegal? We have no evidence of assault, no evidence of weapons discharge, no evidence of traps or physical harm caused by her actions. What do we have? 5 men who trespassed, got lost, and died of exposure. That's what the evidence shows. The 911 call, Hale started, is hearsay from a panicked man who may have been hallucinating from exhaustion. It's not evidence of a crime. Sears closed his folder. Look, I understand the frustration, but unless someone can show me proof of illegal action by Ms. Ashford, I'm ruling these deaths as accidental. Tragic consequences of poor decision-making in hostile terrain. The room was silent. Kessler stood. I want to talk to her one more time. Off the record. He made the drive alone 2 days later. This time, Bryn was not on the porch when he arrived. He knocked and waited. She answered after a moment. Same calm expression, same controlled bearing. Sheriff Kessler. Ms. Ashford, may I come in? She stepped aside. The cabin looked exactly as it had during his last visit. Neat, organized, everything in its place. They sat at the table. No coffee this time, just 2 people having a conversation that would never appear in any official report. We found them, Kessler said. 4 bodies. The 5th is in Montana jurisdiction. Bryn's expression didn't change. I'm sorry for their family's loss. Medical examiner ruled natural causes. Exposure, hypothermia, exhaustion. Accidental deaths resulting from poor judgment in wilderness conditions. That's consistent with what happens when people enter terrain they don't understand. Kessler leaned back in his chair. I did more research on you, dug deeper into your service record, called some contacts who had contacts in the military, found out some interesting things, such as you were SERE instructor certified, survival, evasion, resistance, escape. You taught other soldiers how to resist psychological operations, which means you also taught them how to deploy psychological operations. Bryn said nothing. I found references to an operation in Kandahar, August 2021. You were on a rooftop providing overwatch for an evacuation. 7 targets, 90 seconds. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what happened after. Your spotter died in an IED attack. Sergeant Lucas Brennan. Your reports after that incident show significant emotional trauma, PTSD diagnosis, voluntary discharge 6 months later. That's all in my record, Sheriff. What's your point? My point is that you came here to protect something, to prove you could defend boundaries after failing to protect your friend. And when 5 men violated those boundaries repeatedly, when they threatened you in your own home, you made a decision. Kessler leaned forward. Did you kill those men, Ms. Ashford? Bryn held his gaze. No, Sheriff, I did not kill those men. Did you do anything that resulted in their deaths? I defended my property using the skills I possess. I documented violations for 147 days. I filed police reports that went unanswered. I exhausted every legal option. When those men came to my cabin and threatened me, I stayed inside for my safety. What they chose to do after that, where they chose to go, how they chose to respond to their own fear and guilt and poor decisions, those were their choices, not mine. It was a perfect answer, legally flawless, morally ambiguous, technically true while avoiding the complete truth. Kessler pulled a folder from his jacket. Inside was information that made Bryn's eyes narrow slightly. I found purchase records, he said. Portable Bluetooth speakers, bought by you 3 months ago. High-powered, weatherproof, long battery life. The kind you might use to project sound across distance in wilderness conditions. I like music while I work. I found climbing equipment, professional grade, the kind used for technical ascents. This is mountain property. Climbing skills are useful. I found fishing line, 200 feet, 20-pound test. I fish. No, you don't. There's no fishing rod in this cabin, no tackle, no license on file with Montana Fish and Wildlife. Kessler set the papers down. You used that equipment, didn't you? Used it to create sounds, to move items, to make 5 men believe they were being hunted by something they couldn't see or fight. Bryn was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. Sheriff, if I were to hypothetically have used such equipment, would that be illegal? Is it against the law to play sounds on your own property? To move items around your own land? To position equipment in ways that might create acoustic effects? If it results in deaths, correlation is not causation. If someone trespasses on clearly marked private property, ignores months of warnings, threatens the property owner, and then chooses to flee in panic rather than surrender or seek help, are their subsequent deaths the fault of the property owner or the consequence of their own choices? You're splitting hairs. I'm stating facts. You asked if I killed them. I didn't. You asked if I caused their deaths. I didn't cause anything. I defended my boundaries using legal means. They trespassed using illegal means. They panicked and ran. The mountain killed them, not me. Kessler rubbed his face with both hands. He was exhausted, frustrated, and unable to find a legal angle that would hold up in court. What about Colonel Voss? He asked. You called him, didn't you? The night before this started, asked for advice. Bryn's expression didn't change. Colonel Voss and I discussed property maintenance, solar arrays, and well pumps. Nothing more. You're protecting him. From what? A conversation about maintaining rural property? Kessler stood. He felt older than his 56 years. Let me tell you what I think happened. I think you called Voss and asked for tactical advice. I think he told you about survey data from his Cold War work, about observation posts and psychological warfare and how to use terrain as a weapon. I think you implemented his suggestions with your own training and created a situation where 5 men died without you ever touching them. He walked to the door, then turned back. And I think you're right. I think it was legal. I think every action you took was technically within the bounds of law. You defended your property. You never fired a weapon. You never assaulted anyone. And 5 criminals who repeatedly violated your boundaries died because they made poor choices in response to stimuli you created. Sheriff, I'm not finished. Those men had records. Travis Kendrick put his wife in the hospital twice. Cullen Pritchard was trafficking illegal game. They weren't innocents, but they were people. They had families. And now those families don't have answers because the truth is buried under layers of classification and technical legality. Bryn stood as well. Those men had 147 opportunities to respect my boundaries. They had multiple police reports warning them of consequences. They had clear signage marking private property. They chose to ignore all of it. They chose to escalate to direct threats. And when faced with consequences for their actions, they chose to run rather than face accountability. She walked to the door and opened it. I'm sorry they're dead, Sheriff, but I'm not sorry I defended my land. And if more people come here thinking they can violate my boundaries, thinking that law enforcement won't help me, thinking that I'm helpless because I'm alone, they will learn the same lesson. This land has boundaries. Those boundaries are absolute, and choices have consequences. Kessler stepped outside. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. If there's evidence, he said quietly, equipment, recordings, communications, now would be the time to ensure there isn't any. Bryn met his eyes. Already handled, Sheriff. He nodded once. Then he got in his truck and drove away. After his truck disappeared, Bryn went back inside. She opened a drawer and removed the satellite phone she had used to call Colonel Voss. The call log showed one outgoing call, 4 minutes, 3 weeks ago. She removed the SIM card, removed the battery, took both outside and used a rock to pulverize the SIM into fragments too small to recover data from. She buried the fragments in her garden, 20 feet apart, 18 inches deep, marked the spots mentally to plant tomatoes over them in spring. The night was quiet. Bryn stood in her garden for a long moment, hands dirty from burying the evidence, looking up at the stars that filled the Montana sky with cold light. She thought about the phone call, 4 minutes that had changed everything. Colonel Voss's voice. Fear makes people stupid. Stupid people make mistakes. He had been right. She thought about the 72 hours, the sounds in the darkness, the equipment moved, the terror she had engineered without ever touching them. She thought about the 5 men, their choices, their consequences, their families who would never know the complete truth. And she thought about Lucas, always Lucas. Can't protect everyone, Raven, but you tried. She had tried, and this time she had succeeded. Not in saving everyone, but in protecting what was hers. Bryn walked back inside, washed the dirt from her hands, and for the first time in 18 months, she was ready to face the photograph she had kept hidden. She opened the drawer. Lucas Brennan's photograph came out slowly. She turned it face up and studied it in the lamplight. His smile, the confidence in his eyes, the Ranger scroll visible on his shoulder. Taken just hours before the IED that took him away. She carried it to the mantel and placed it beside her Silver Star citation. 2 pieces of a past she had tried to bury but could never escape. I protected something this time, Lucas, she said to the photograph. Her voice was quiet in the empty cabin. Not everyone, never everyone, but something. She traced the edge of the frame with one finger. Lucas smiled back at her, frozen in that moment before the IED, before the fall, before the last 4 minutes she had held him while his life bled away on cobble streets. You said I couldn't save everyone. You were right, but you were wrong about one thing. She set down her coffee mug. You said I tried, past tense, like it was over. Outside, the mountains stretched in every direction. Her mountains now, defended, secured, won. I'm still trying, Lucas. Every morning I walk this fence line. Every day I defend these boundaries. Not because I've made peace with losing you, but because you taught me that trying, even when you fail, is what makes you human. She raised her mug in salute. To boundaries, to choices, to consequences, and to the people we couldn't save, but who saved us by teaching us how to fight. The photograph didn't answer, but for the first time since placing it face down 18 months ago, Bryn felt like she could breathe in the same room with Lucas's memory. Not peace, not closure, but coexistence. She could live with that. The mountains were quiet as full darkness fell. Somewhere in that darkness, wildlife was reclaiming territory. Elk returning to migration routes, wolves establishing dens, the forest healing from 15 years of human violation. And on the porch of a cabin at 7,000 feet, a woman sat with a rifle across her lap and maps spread on the table beside her, watching, waiting, ready. 6 months later, Bryn walked her morning fence line and found fresh graffiti on the eastern posts. Not vandalism, warnings. 5 men ignored warnings. 5 men died. Don't be number 6. Below it, different handwriting. Respect boundaries or become a warning for others. She didn't remove them. They served her purpose better than any signs she could post. Her trail camera showed 2 hunters had approached the boundary at dawn. Young men. They'd read the signs, argued briefly, then left without crossing. Day 543, 0 violations. The pattern held. She closed the notebook and looked out over her land. 640 acres of wilderness that was finally, completely, hers. The price had been high. 5 men dead, her soul carrying weight that would never fully lift. But the alternative had been surrender, had been accepting that boundaries meant nothing when law enforcement couldn't protect them. Bryn Ashford had chosen not to surrender, had chosen to fight with every skill she possessed, had chosen to win. And she had won. Somewhere in the valley below, Sheriff Kessler was filing his final report. Accidental deaths, case closed, no evidence of criminal activity. Somewhere in Virginia, Colonel Garrett Voss was reading a newspaper article about wildlife recovery in Sector 7. Smiling slightly at the knowledge that his survey data had finally served its purpose. Somewhere in countless hunting camps across Montana, men were telling the story of the woman on the Morrison property, warning each other, teaching the lesson that 5 others had learned too late. Boundaries were real, consequences were certain, and some people, when pushed, would push back in ways that redefined what was possible. Bryn stood and walked to the mantel. Lucas Brennan's photograph was there now, no longer hidden. Beside it, in a simple frame, was her Silver Star citation. For extraordinary heroism in combat operations, for actions under fire that resulted in the successful extraction of 23 civilian personnel, for demonstrated valor in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. She had earned that medal through precision and courage in a place where both were required for survival. She had defended this land through the same precision and courage. Different enemy, different battlefield, same warrior. The sun was setting. Tomorrow she would walk her fence line again, document that everything remained secure, check trail cameras, maintain the systems that kept her boundaries clear. But tonight she allowed herself a moment of peace. The hunt was over. The territory was secured. The mission was complete. Corporal Bryn Ashford had come to Montana seeking distance from a past she couldn't change. She had found instead a present she could defend, and in defending it had created a future where her boundaries would be respected. Not through law enforcement, through reputation. Not through courts, through consequences so clear no one dared test them again. The mountains remembered, the forest remembered, and everyone who came near her land would remember. Bryn Ashford was no longer running from anything. She had stopped, had stood her ground, had defended her boundaries, and won.